Skip Bayless is one of the most controversial and loud voices in sports reporting and journalism. His shows are very popular in terms of viewing figures. You just have to look at when he made a transition over from ESPN First Take, where actually it was initially his partner Stephen A. Smith who was the better known journalist, obviously had his own show in the 2000s, Stephen A. I'm talking about here, to when he moved over to Undisputed on FS1, where he partnered with a new person in Shannon Sharp, and his show, when contrasted against his former show, which still runs with Max Kellerman replacing him, I think vastly outstrips it and appears to be much more popular and more directly engaged with the fans in replies and responses and how avidly people watch it. So it's clear that some people like him, a lot of people don't like him, but a lot of people collectively from both those groups watch him. And so even people who don't love him clearly love to hate him. He has that villain appeal where he has high viewing numbers as such. Now, these are the fact people love to hate him. Sure, there's lots of reasons why. He appears in certain senses to be biased, especially if you don't necessarily know his reasoning or his history for certain comments, because he might be making comments against someone who's a fantastic player, seemingly downplaying how good they are. He's got a willingness to make controversial and bold statements that go against the grain and what the consensus think and what the average fan thinks, or what you're allowed to think, what the consensus is enforced by, a certain line you have to toe, or comments you're not supposed to make based on things behind the scenes or the elephant in the room scenario. He also has a lack of fear tied into that, criticizing big names. So LeBron is someone who's a candidate to have been the MVP in the NBA, something legitimately like 9 or 10 years in a row now. He has no problem criticizing this guy or pointing out his biggest flaws, despite the fact people like LeBron are individuals where people who are members of the media, journalists especially, try not to get on the bad side of this sort of person, because if he calls you out or if he denies you interviews or if he says something in any way hostile towards you, people are worried about that. People are worried that it'll turn people against their viewer base, their reader base, their fans, etc. So those types of people, especially in the modern day, have a massive amount of influence over the media and how they're treated and how they're written about. He's someone who's not afraid to go at these people as if they were a third string player or a specials teams player or some guy who just rides the bench and gets 3 minutes. He'll criticize them the same way if it's appropriate. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to make this video is not only as an outsider, as someone who likes to watch shows and talk about sports, have I seen him mischaracterized, misunderstood, slighted, misaligned with values and opinions and behavior that I do not think applies to him or that he engages in at all. But he's also someone who I am aligned with myself in many instances within esports, but in a derogatory fashion. I only ever hear it in a derogatory fashion. Now, funnily enough, I spin that and I take it as a compliment because I consider Skip Bayless to be the best journalist or broadcaster in sports. I think he's polished. I think he's entertaining. I think he's pretty knowledgeable. I think he's very bold with his opinions. I think at times he can be quite wise, actually, because of such the unique position he's in as an outsider, but who's managed to take over part of the mainstream and is able, as someone who was independent in a sense, to not have to kowtow to the opinions or the feelings or the egos of big players or historical sacred cows that someone can say whatever he wants, but does it in an entertaining and intelligent and a timely fashion, quite frankly. So many people, if they were to describe him, will go a different way and they'll say, no. This guy, he's clueless. He just doesn't know anything about the game. He's a blowhard. Oh, he's just a contrarian who just says the opposite to what everyone else thinks. He just says wild things for money or for clicks or for views. Obviously, you say views in the sports context, say clicks in esports. Now, I consider these to be utterly ridiculous statements. As someone who's watched a lot of Skip Bayless' shows, has charted his history, has watched interviews with him, let's start at the top. Because one of the key elements, obviously, to take on his role of being a pundit, being an analyst, being an expert, is you've got to be knowledgeable, you've got to have a level of expertise. Skip Bayless is not, as people will suggest, just a fan, just a guy who got a mic and started saying crazy shit and that's it. The reason why he is in his position, aside from all the rest of the show of how entertaining he is and how he's one of the only people who can and does say these controversial things, you have to understand, Skip Bayless has been a sports journalist in some context. I looked it up online for something like 48 years. That is longer than most people listening to him have been alive. So the entire span of their lives and more, he's been watching sports on an in-depth level, studying it, reading about it, learning the context of it. As a journalist, he's learned how to frame it, how to tell stories, how to contrast things through history. This guy is incredibly knowledgeable and has a long tenure within sports. He's someone who was there on the beat around the likes of Michael Jordan when he was in his heyday winning championships with the Bulls. He's been around and known people within locker rooms, within teams. Therefore, when he speaks about Terrell Owens being a divisive figure within certain locker rooms, he knows directly from people in those locker rooms that are friends of his, are confidants of his. He knows from what was going on around the league. He wasn't a guy who just looks in and gives his comment. He's been directly embedded. He was like a war reporter, but in the context of sports, he was there on the beat for some very historic things, and he was in the mix to where he knows more than the average fan, even in terms of just purely being informed. He's also someone, as such, who when he comments on players, on teams, on historical things, has watched the games. He even goes back and watches some of the games. He's someone who has done his homework. He's watched the games. He's got the framework of knowledge. He runs the numbers. He always comes with his stats, and he has the correct stats on things. This is not someone who lacks knowledge or expertise in any sense. He's someone, and one thing I actually really respect about him, is that he has a consistent set of criteria and philosophies for how he models different sports, the best players, the different roles, what should make up the blueprint of a championship team, when people compete against each other, player performance, who threw the game away, who did well in the game. He has a very consistent set of philosophies, which if you just were to write down what they were, and then go and take any team or player or event and put it through those philosophies and go, right, well, here's what he should say and what he would say. If you go and find the video where he talks about that, I'll guarantee it's very close to what you're able to predict based on his actual philosophies and the reasoning he gives. And therefore, there's very similar players he likes. There's very similar players he doesn't like. There's very similar players that he thinks are the best or routinely cites above another group who he doesn't like as much and perhaps seems to downplay. So, for example, one thing I noticed is he puts a massive emphasis in his own personal criteria and philosophy on the game on people who have the best performance in the biggest, most high-profile games and moments. So that is often misunderstood as him only caring about you winning rings or championships. Now, while he does use numbers a lot, that's also because numbers at the beginning of a discussion are a very good way to frame the discussion, and then you have the discussion picking about, well, I don't think that number quite applies, and this number isn't quite as good as it is. You put in all the context, but it sets up the debate to how to put in that context. So it's a good place to start his numbers, and he'll often do that. But you look at his appreciation for people who performed these massive moments, and it's no surprise, right, that he has this massive respect for Joe Montana of the San Francisco 49ers in the late 80s, early 90s, Tom Brady of the Patriots in the 2010s, 2000s, Michael Jordan in the Bulls, obviously from the 90s. These were people who succeeded at the highest level more often than not, came up with the big clutch games and the big massive performance on the biggest possible stage, and therefore they're the people he respects the most because those are some of the primary criteria that he cares about, the criteria that he decides means more than the rest. He is someone who uses stats, and I would say sometimes maybe too much. Like, for example, one area that I've noticed I personally consider a weakness because I don't agree with this philosophy is when it comes to NFL players, he will often cite, for example, a quarterback's win-loss rate in the playoffs. Whereas, I mean, you can have a terrible defense and sometimes you're very rarely going to win playoff games. You can be an amazing team and you just get upset in a one-off fluke because the NFL's best of one. So I do think he goes too far with certain elements of that, especially the reason I give the NFL example is you have so many players involved in affecting the outcome. I mean, just the kicker missing sometimes loses you the game. That's not the fault of the quarterback. So I do feel like that's an example of where I think some of his philosophies are less valuable or break down a little bit, but I still respect the conclusions he comes to because he's consistent. And that's something I appreciate. Yeah, that's not in any way how he's portrayed. He's portrayed as a guy who just looks at what everyone else says and says, right, how can I go the other way and say something really crazy that everyone's going to get upset about? Don't see that at all. So this is an issue let's talk about. The idea that he's a blowhard or a contrarian or it's just about controversy and riling people up. Like, first of all, I have to say, I haven't watched him for a long time. He actually doesn't pick contrarian opinions. What he does is, if he has an opinion that happens to be a contrarian opinion, as in his opinion really is very different from the traditional answer or the mainstream opinion or what generally fans think, then he'll definitely make sure that gets a lot of airtime. And that's front and center because, yes, that's box office. People are interested to hear that because they want to hear a different voice. They want to hear other people saying things. But that comes organically. And guess what? Those are the times where, because it's going to go so against the grain, that is going to, first of all, blow up even more and be reported upon more and get more attention. And it's also going to be remembered more because people who disagree are going to remember, we say, yeah, but remember he said LeBron chokes or whatever. They're going to remember that much more than the thing he said that they agreed with. They're going to go, well, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, that's correct. they're going to forget that part. Well, likewise, an obvious corollary to this is people will say, yeah, but of course he has contrary opinions. He just finds a way to talk about LeBron all the time. It's not like he just sits there and makes up a topic about LeBron that has no relevance to now and shouldn't be talked about. Talks about LeBron a lot. The same reason everyone in the NBA talks about LeBron a lot, or talked about Aaron Rodgers in the NFL, because these guys are massive box office superstar names who succeed and then sometimes fail and are very, very good, but at the same time can be criticized. And people want to hear you talk about these people. So their box office, they sell. Therefore, yes, if opinions are there that he can talk about LeBron, he's going to bring them up. And if there's topics where he can talk about LeBron, he's going to do that as well. But these aren't fake opinions. These aren't opinions created out of thin air just to upset people. So the idea that he does it for attention or views, I have to say, as someone, I've been involved in esports journalism now for about 16 years, over 16 years. And from viewing the way people make similar comments like this, like, oh, you just do it for attention or views, to me and other people in my field, I have to say, I've almost never seen that argument from someone who's credible, someone who's intelligent or knows a lot about the industry, especially journalism. I've actually almost never seen that. And that's because that sort of opinion is like a little child's analysis of the industry. It's how a teenager who's just starting to see little parts of how the world works might think about the way that something works. It would be like saying, why is tax money spent inefficiently? And saying, every politician is just corrupt, aren't they? They just steal it all for themselves, right? On some level, there is corruption going on. There's mismanagement, there's incompetence. Some people are stealing. But to just say that with no real understanding of the specifics and exactly how and who would be the ones doing it, it's ridiculous to tar everyone who's doing that. And yet that's what happens here. So I have to say, it's a notable type of analysis to say X just... It's always just, by the way, as though it was no big deal. They just do this and have all the success. X just does Y, right? That is notable analysis from people with no working understanding or knowledge of an industry or the dynamics or mechanisms which determine success. Because first of all, there's no just. When you're talking about how did someone become the most popular, most influential, most notoriety, the broadcaster or journalism with the most notoriety in the entire world as a person who was never a former pro, how did someone do that? There's no just. He didn't just do so. As I said here, he worked for 48 years. And he only got this massive success the last, 15 years? 10 years? So the scale he's at now, there was no just involved. Secondly, the idea that you can narrow down a guy's entire career, the complex social dynamics of who people like and who they want to watch and what opinions they want to hear, but then when they're willing to hear opinions they disagree with and how you'd have to frame those, and then entertainment and all this showmanship and polish and working on your models and learning expertise. There's no just involved. Again, that's why it's like a child's analysis, because you take a massive problem that's very complex and that you probably never will understand all the elements of it, and you go, right, eliminate all these, find one factor and say it's just because of this one thing, that's why all the rest happened. It's like how a child would think about things. I don't know anyone who is very, very famous in the sports world who just sits around and does things for the views or the clicks to get mainstream attention. Like, there are some people who might do it. Maybe there's some sports talk show guy who's very small I haven't heard of. But none of the massive people are like that, as far as I can tell, in esports or in sports. I certainly don't think it's the case that they just make it up. I mean, for a start off, the reason why that's also a child's opinion is it essentially just makes it a kind of conspiracy, right? So they think somehow Skip Bayless is an idiot who doesn't know anything and he makes his opinion. But they also simultaneously assign to him some godlike level of ability to analyze an industry, despite the fact in every other area they think he's an idiot who can't figure anything out. Some godlike ability to know exactly what opinion to say and how it will be received and that it will be popular and all this. There's nobody like that in the world. Nobody can just guarantee success at that. He does, in as much as he's become a very interesting, compelling person who's managed to say what he wants in an entertaining way, and yes, be confrontational, but yes, have some arguments to back it up with that other people can fly off of. There's a lot of skill and polish and work's gone into that. Then people will say, well, he's just biased, isn't he? Right? I can certainly see how it would appear biased because you don't like the opinion. Therefore, by the way, that's the general shorthand. When a fan says you're biased, what they mean is I totally disagree with your opinion, but can't articulate why, won't respond to any of your points, and I'm just going to say that I don't need to because I'll dismiss your whole argument by saying you must just be biased, square brackets, because you don't believe what I believe. So, for example, when he talks about Terrell Owens, and he says that Terrell Owens shouldn't be a Hall of Famer, yes, if like me, you watch the NFL when Terrell Owens played, and you were like, holy shit, this guy's one of the most talented wide receivers ever, one of the best to ever play. Yes, on that basis, he should be a Hall of Famer. But what is the main reason why Skip Bayless has always said Terrell Owens shouldn't be? Because they do now, as part of the NFL Hall of Fame, consider off-the-field activities. Whether you're a good teammate, whether you're a divisive force, what you were like in practice. They consider these part now of the criteria. So on that criteria, he has a point. If you're going to go by that criteria, he thinks that he was divisive and that as good as he was, he actually stopped some of his teams from winning Super Bowls. Yeah, I can see a point in that. Don't agree myself, but I can see where he's come from. It's consistent with his philosophy. Likewise, LeBron, one of the best players of all time, probably a top 10 player to ever play basketball, being a fantastic player again and again. Oh, Skip Bayless is biased against LeBron, right? No, if you notice the criteria that Skip Bayless values the most, being super clutch in the big moment, being the guy with the determined killer instinct who doesn't crumble emotionally, LeBron has been quite far from those aspects at times in his career. He's been a fantastic all-around player, and every single day of the week he's going to be good, but at times he has lacked killer instinct. At times he has seemed like a guy who questioned himself or played differently under the bright lights wilted away as it was. These things have happened. It's not like it's unreasonable. Now, yes, he maybe goes too ham with it, but first of all, so few other people are ever willing to bring it up. Like everyone who brings up now that 2 years ago, when LeBron won the NBA title 2 years ago, people actually used to be like, oh, he's a top 2 player. Some people said he's the best player ever. None of those people ever, when describing why he's so good and all the great things he's done, ever bring up that 2011 finals. They never bring up what happened against the Mavericks. Now, yeah, Skip Bayless does it a bit too much, especially because he did coin that catchphrase, the chosen one becomes the frozen one. He does reference that a bit too much. He definitely references the fucking Ray Allen three-pointer against the Spurs too much, as though like that one shot he was suddenly supposed to take away, but every other shot counts for the players that he likes. Yeah, he does have certain areas where, because I disagree with the criteria, it might seem unreasonable, but it actually isn't. It does fit consistently his criteria. I just happen to disagree with the outcome of it, but I can respect the opinion. I actually think part of why he seems biased and why people don't like him is because, unlike so many people, and admittedly, like I said before, a lot of the people who do this just can't get popular. They can't get it. It's a very difficult tightrope to walk, saying something someone dislikes, but having them still want to hear you say it. That's actually very tough to achieve. It's something that I've managed to accomplish myself in my career, and very lucky to have done so, although a lot of hard work went into it as well. So one of the reasons I also think that he gets this controversy around him is because, unlike so many people, he's willing to go at what I call this sacred cows of sports, or the royalty, as I often call them in an esports context. The people who, because they are legends and they are amazing and they have at times been the best or done the best things, people don't want to criticize the other areas. Or they say, hey, you can't say that. How can you say Michael Jordan's not the best player? You know, things like that. He doesn't necessarily just buy into the consensus that's there, because, by the way, the consensus in sports broadcasting and journalism is kind of like in esports. It is a ludicrous echo chamber of agreement, and especially trying to pander to fans and maintain consistent narratives. People will act like it's actually blasphemy, like you must not have any intellectual value if you could dare suggest that anyone else was the greatest NBA player, not Michael Jordan. Now, here's the thing. If I had to pick someone, I would pick Michael Jordan as the best, but I could absolutely make a really good case for a few other people on other criteria, and I think it's entirely valid. I don't think it's some clear-cut, closed matter that can't be discussed, and that there's only one set of criteria by which to judge people. I also think the idea that he's this contrarian who makes up controversial opinions is so ignorant, because I think if you look, his opinions are quite consistent as well. And from what I've seen of him in interviews and in the context of his shows, he seems like he is a very earnest person. Like, he legitimately thinks what he is saying. There's an interview I'll list here and put in the description below, where him and Stephen A. Smith a few years ago were interviewed by Larry King, the great American interviewer. And if you watch this interview, you might actually get a little peek behind the curtain of the show and the persona of Skip Bayless and see what an earnest individual he is. He has put in the hard yards and does work very diligently and actually cares a lot about trying to get his opinions as legit as possible and doing his homework and then coming up with what he wants to say and then selling it with showmanship. So it's not that he just disagrees or, you know, he has to have an opposite opinion to the other guy on the shots. I don't think people always present. No, actually, what's funny is there's many episodes I've seen of First Take and Undisputed where he agrees with Shannon Sharp. Like if they're talking about Tom Brady being the best player in the NFL, for example. Or if they were talking about Michael Jordan being the best NBA player, or if they're talking about who the number one team was at a certain time. There's many times I've seen them both agree, but they are able to give different points because they are different people. And that is a key point I want to make, because it's a point I run into all the time, is that people think just because he has a different opinion to the consensus that he's a contrarian. But the problem with that logic is there aren't only two positions or two opinions possible. He has a different opinion in the same sense I often do, because he has lived a very intense, in-depth life in sports that the consensus can't cover. The consensus is some experts that agree, and then loads of fans who watch the game casually, and some people watch the game even more casually, and it starts at the beginning with a group of people who are experts, but eventually it waters down to everyone, and that becomes the consensus essentially. If you are someone who has put in as much work on an individual basis, learning the game, modeling the game, watching the game, going back and revisiting things and reflecting on them, thinking up your own criteria of how you model things, then putting things into that, then debating it, you're going to end up with very specialized, very individual, unique opinions that won't be shared by the consensus, because only you could have arrived at these opinions because they represent you so much. And ideally, everyone will come to these. So guess what? Shannon Sharp comes to his own opinions. Stephen A. Smith comes to his own opinions. These guys all do it. You can argue Skip Bayless is just better at it because he somehow engages you more and you want to hear his more and you remember his more. You don't remember the others as much, which is funny because in the early days, it was actually Stephen A. Smith who used to get a lot of the headlines for being the guy who made the crazy comments that people were mad about. So let me ask you this as a thought exercise, right? If he's a contrarian, and if he just picks opinions that will generate a lot of controversy, get a lot of views, and therefore get attention, which can be converted through sponsorships and advertisers into money, and him make a lot of money from getting a lot of views. If he was like that, then isn't he doing a terrible job at it? Because why does he so fervently, even when there's cases to be made against it, support Tom Brady as the best NFL player of all time, support Joe Montana as like the ultimate winner in football, support Michael Jordan as the best basketball player, maybe best sports star to ever play again? Why not go with the more edgy picks, which you definitely can make a case for, but are a bit more edgy and have their own logic to them, and some people will really like it who feel like they were outsiders because they're the only one who said it? Why doesn't he go with Peyton Manning as the best quarterback ever, or Dan Marino, or Aaron Rodgers? These people you could definitely make a case on skill or raw numbers are up there, and you could say, I don't care about championships as much. You know why he doesn't do that? Because his criteria is championships, and it is having a great record in the playoffs, and it is certain factors of what he considers making your teammates better and having that killer instinct and being the best player. That's why he comes up with these opinions. He's not a contrarian particularly. I also think people massively underestimate and downplay, because again they don't understand the mechanisms and how difficult this is, how polished he is, how articulate he is, what a great showman he is. I know myself from learning these qualities to be an analyst for CSGO. You don't just come out the womb, no matter how smart you are, being able to speak very well and being able to make a point very well and being able to add polish and showmanship and be entertaining. No, this is a guy who makes his points, whether you agree with the points and how he arrived at them, very well. He'll lay out the points, and then he'll come to his conclusion, drawing on the points he's made before, which connected together. He is much, much better at this than practically every former pro NFL, NBA player who is on these shows or in sports and broadcasting journalism as pundits, as experts, as like key people who can give you insight. He makes his points better than them. He's more articulate. He's also fantastically entertaining while he does it, which is pretty cool, right? And because he's so entertaining, even if you dislike him, you engage with what he's saying and you argue against it, or you say, I don't agree with that, and then you give your opinion. It engages people. It gets people passionate about the sport because you feed off his passion. You match his energy in a way. And he can deliver that kind of performance every single day. It's amazing how consistent this guy is in that respect. Doesn't seem to have a day where he just comes in and phones it in and looks like he's not feeling it, etc. He understands this is a very privileged position he's in, and he absolutely makes the most of his shot. He's actually a guy who is a great success story, someone who made himself. He's a self-made man. He's also, and something I really respect, and it's something I've tried to mirror in my career for most of it, is he's not afraid of his guests or his co-hosts or disagreeing with them. Just because they are champions in the NFL, he doesn't say, well, if you think that, I mean, I sort of think this, but I guess you're right because you want. No, he battles them. He meets them on the battlefield of opinions, ideas. You have to then use your weapons of logic and reasoning and models, and these are the things you debate over. It doesn't matter that guy's a champion and he's not. That's irrelevant. I also think He's produced some of the best episodes as a result. I mean, one of my favorites of all time, I'll link it if I can find it, is when he had Terrell Owens and they had a huge argument where they went back and forth over little key details of Terrell Owens' career, including what he did at different times. This was fantastic television and taught you a lot more about Terrell Owens from Terrell Owens' side because it was prompted by a guy who wasn't afraid to actually go head to head with him and disagree with him and press him on certain points. I think another area that's very underrated because people don't give any credit to his showmanship because, again, people who are very immature in how they view these things go, well, I disagree with his opinion, therefore he's just shit in every way. And then you go, yeah, but he's a great showman, isn't he? He's very entertaining. Nah, he isn't. Just say stuff for views. One of the areas people really downplay is he pairs with anyone. You can bring any guest, any host, any ex-player, get anyone on that desk, and he does a great job with all of them. Partly because he's not afraid, and also because he knows the business. I mean, you can see his transition from First Take to Undisputed. He was the main talent. It's clear to me at this point in time, because he was very good on First Take. It was a great show. I enjoyed his relationship with Stephen A. Smith. It's not as good a show now. Meanwhile, his show on Undisputed is fantastic still. Now Shannon Sharp's suddenly become that person who's taken up the Stephen A. Smith role in a very different way, admittedly, and it's dynamite, isn't it? It's box office, it's entertaining as fuck. Ultimately, what you can say about Stephen A. Smith, about Skip Bayless, is his opinion matters due to all of the above. Because he's an expert, because he knows how to think, because he's got his own model and criteria, because he can articulate himself, because he's very polished, he's great on camera, he's very entertaining and articulate. He's someone who's willing to go at people, he's willing to give his opinion. His opinions will often be different because of who he is and his background. So here's the thing. It's funny because I actually wasn't directly influenced by Skip Bayless. I only started watching his stuff maybe like 5 years ago. Obviously, I've in theory followed a similar career path, which is why I found it interesting, the more similarities I've seen, because Skip Bayless also is unlike many of those other people in his position, in that he wasn't a pro. So he doesn't have the initial credibility from being a pro. Well, I don't either. He, just like me, he started out just covering the games, covering the players. They were the news, they were everything that was important, and he was just a guy relaying what they were saying. But in time, thanks to working on his own craft, he has become a pundit, has become notable, influential for his opinions. His opinion is now part of sports, is part of the story, is part of the history of the game. Now, what's funny is, for such a reviled and misunderstood character, I will actually contrast him with someone who is beloved in sports. One of the most popular people ever to be a non-ex-pro and yet do punditry and journalism in sports, and that would be Bill Simmons. And this is a guy who pretty much has the opposite rep. People love him. People think he is knowledgeable. People think he really does a good job with his opinions. And yes, people will say he's too biased because they'll say he's a homer and a fanboy, and he admits as much himself. But here's the funny thing. I used to like Bill Simmons years ago when he was doing Page 2 online on ESPN, etc. Problem is, for me, he is the prime example. This is why I want to contrast him with Skip Bayless, of someone who makes that famous saying so accurate. The one that says, give a man a reputation as an early riser and he can sleep till noon. As in, if everyone just says, oh, that guy always gets up early, it doesn't matter that you don't, and people rarely see you ever up before that. They'll just assume it must be the case. And without investigating it, that's what will pass around as your reputation. And at that point, you may as well just sleep in, right? Because you've already got the reputation. You don't need to do it anymore. But here's the funny thing. Bill Simmons' reputation is based on how he was legitimately 7 to 10 to 15 years ago. Nowadays, when I've seen Bill Simmons on television, which is a much worse medium for him, by the way, or on podcasts, which is all right, but he tends to be fairly limited in his opinions. He was at his best as a writer, and you don't see a lot of that. I have to say, I feel like he phones in a lot of it now. I do feel like he pushes certain narratives and storylines that he's come up with or his conclusions he's arrived at too much. It does seem like he doesn't really... He changes quite slowly in those respects, and I feel it's sometimes a little bit hacky how he tries to crowbar an opinion in or crowbar the game into fitting his narrative. I also feel like he's way too swayed by single games, which either just happened to be the game he solved that team or was like a one-off playoff game that he thought was significant. He will play those into narratives too much. By the way, Skip Bayless sometimes does that as well, too much, as I've said with the LeBron example of the Ray Allen shot before. He's also someone, Bill Simmons, who seemingly... you can tell when he hasn't been watching a team much. Like, the way he'll talk about them, it just becomes very clear when you've been a fan of his for a long time. And unfortunately, I have to say, the number of teams and sports that he began to talk about in that tone, where I get the sense that he didn't watch them very much, seems to have increased over the years. I also, as a sidebar, which I won't get into a lot, maybe I could do a whole video on this sometime, I know people love his basketball book. There's parts of it I love. It's very good intro to the NBA and its history for some players. One of my problems with that book, though, is that when you talk about the NBA, you have to be able to talk about the 1960s and 1970s. They were a very key period where there were a lot of great players, particularly at the center position. And I have to say, I think his take on those players in that book is very ignorant. It's very simplistic. I think it's disingenuous. And I think at times it's dishonest, because way too much of it is from not watching the games because there aren't any and there wasn't very much access at the time. But he's not explicit enough about that, in my opinion. Secondly, I think he goes way too much on the opinions of people he likes and just takes their opinion and makes it into his own, whereas I don't feel like it's a genuine organic opinion that came from watching the games. I feel like he's given too much credence to other people and he's just a vehicle for their voice, as it were. And some of the things he says, I just think he goes too hard with them. That book to me was the ultimate example of how he sometimes takes a decent narrative and forces everything to fit it. Obvious examples being Wilt Chamberlain, etc. If you heard the way he talked about Wilt Chamberlain and then people who watched the games and were experts at the time, it's so different that it feels very biased to me. And as I said, I think he goes way too much off results. Finally, another quality of his that I don't like and is very different from Skip Bayless's is I feel as though he puts way too much stock in his personal relationships with either friends of his who are other journalists or celebrity friends like other pro players. They seem to affect his opinion a lot. So when he has people on podcasts, he goes at them a little bit, but not much. And he generally seems to accept a lot of what they say. Like if they say something about inside the team, he almost accepts it as gospel, even though, 10 people in that team might have a different opinion or different take or phrase what they were saying a different way. But he has one little inside source and suddenly, now what a surprise, he starts to talk that way himself whenever he does these things. I feel like he isn't critical enough or abrasive enough with the people he loves. And so I can see their opinions and their biases bleed over into his work. With that said, he's certainly entertaining. He's certainly done a good job of building his brand. And he has his own qualities and was a very good journalist, I think, like a decade ago. It was excellent at that point in time. So to summarize, I think the sports world is a brighter, more lively, well-rounded, more intelligent and interesting place as a result of Skip Bayless's presence in it.